Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to Cinelit. Today we take a trip a long time ago in the very near future. Today we are heading into the dystopian futures of 1997 and 2013 with John Carpenter's Escape from New York and Escape from LA. Both films are celebrating milestone birthdays, with Escape from New York hitting 40 and Escape from LA hitting 25. So, my name is Adam Marsh, and as ever I am joined by Cinelit's resident expert Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
I'm good, thanks, Adam. I've escaped from whatever I was supposed to be doing this morning to come here and talk about at least one great film and one maybe not so great, but with with decent elements of its own. So looking forward to chatting about these, and the people who go to the Quad a lot and see movies all the time in Derby will know what big fans we are of John Carpenter there.
Yeah, well, obviously we are big fans of John Carpenter, and if you aren't, why not? We love his work here. We've done days of programming dedicated to his films, and the well hasn't run dry, filming 4 or 5 films a day repeatedly, and we still manage to show different films. I think it's really quite good pulling out a couple from his career, particularly these two, because they, in some ways, are a little different strand to Carpenter's career, aside from the horror stuff that he's done. So it's nice being able to pull that out, and when we eventually come, I say eventually, we will eventually come to do a podcast on John Carpenter, we can probably focus in a little bit more on his horror legacy. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about his action science fiction legacy with Escape from New York and Escape from LA. We both survived, Daryl.
We have. As you say, the films are set in those futuristic years of 1997 and 2013, and it's easy to sort of scoff and laugh when people do that now. You watch Blade Runner or you watch Back to the Future or whatever, the date come off, everyone laughs, and it's great. There's the famous quote from Richard Corliss, the writer for Time magazine for many years, who said, nothing ages quite so quickly as yesterday's vision of the future. And very true. But I think while you're chuckling at those on-screen dates in Escape from New York, do remember that, or note that this is a rather sort of Trumpian world that Carpenter's suggesting way back when. He made the films in 81 and 96. So we're throwing a lot of dates around here. And people that are fans of John Carpenter will know from his other work that if you look at a film like They Live, for instance, he's a fiercely political filmmaker and a very left-wing filmmaker, and uses horror and uses science fiction and uses different genres to put over political points. And so he's almost predicting, if not directly a sort of Donald Trump type figure in the presidents that are in these movies, it's very much that sort of world. And even more sort of pinpointed than that, who knew? In the opening minutes of Escape from New York, we get a hijacked aeroplane hurtling towards the World Trade Center. So there's prescience for you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he had his own president that had been causing trouble and controversy in America to provide the fertile groundwork for this film with Richard Nixon. So
yeah, and you just got Reagan into office at the time Escape from New York's being made. So, and Carpenter was no fan of him either. But again, you don't get a Nixon or Ronald Reagan caricature here. You know, the president is played in a very different way, but the characteristics are there and the political beliefs are there.
So John Carpenter wanted to make this film as a follow-up to Assault on Precinct 13. And Dark Star around that period. He wrote it in 76, I think he said, and he was ready to make it, but he just couldn't, so he had to go and make other films to, I guess, build up enough cred to get the budget he needed to do this film. So it's rooted in that 70s thing, but when you look at it, you think this and another film released in 1979, The Warriors, single-handedly propped up the Italian film industry for about 5 years.
Absolutely. I'd throw in Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior to that as well. So the number of Italian rip-offs that sort of steal from those three movies, often sort of amalgamating all three, you know, and then a lot of those ended up getting British cinema release too. So you might well have seen films like Bronx Warriors and so on in the cinema very soon after seeing the John Carpenter movie or seeing The Warriors or seeing the George Miller film. But yeah, this is the source, very definitely.
I think obviously with Escape from New York and indeed Escape from LA, for good or ill, they are rooted in the towns as much as they are rooted in that main character as their appeal. And New York City in this film, even though it was shot mostly in St. Louis, it does live and breathe on its depiction of New York in this movie. In that way, it's very much like The Warriors. I got a real Warriors vibe to this when I was watching it. I can see the influences that the Warriors had on John Carpenter as well.
Sure.
Particularly with the Frank Doubleday character coming out and meeting the SWAT team as they first arrive in New York on Manhattan Island.
Yeah, I want to talk more about his performance as we go. I think he's the core of the film. I think, but there is definitely that sort of feel that the city is a character sort of thing, you know. And interestingly, what Carpenter does in both films, and this is all part of his satire, you know, because these are very, very heavily satirical movies. Manhattan's already an island, but he sort of emphasises that by walling it off, you know, building a Donald Trump wall around it. And again, what a prediction, you know, and goes a step further in the Escape from LA, which we'll talk about in depth, by suggesting that LA has actually sort of separated itself from mainland America as a result of sort of natural disaster. And the politicians have taken advantage of that by saying, right, you're not part of the United States anymore. And then guess what? Walling it off.
Always a wall, isn't it?
Yeah.
Always a bloody wall. Anyway, I think back to New York. He really works hard on making it feel like a real place. I mean, it's shot in the streets of St. Louis rather than New York because the buildings were very similar to New York. They didn't do it on a soundstage for this kind of thing because they wanted to make it feel authentic and real. But the amount of things that they managed to do in St. Louis was ridiculous. They managed to convince the council, the city council, to switch off the electricity to 10 blocks while they were shooting at night. Well, for God knows how long they were shooting there. It must have been 3 or 4 weeks of shooting.
Yeah.
Where they just switched the electricity off to a whole town. It's a whole 10-block radius.
Yeah, and this isn't Steven Spielberg going in there and saying it. You know, it's John Woo saying it. You know, Carpenter wasn't massive at the time. You know, he had his big hit with Halloween. His films had done pretty well, and he was just in the early stages of making a name for himself, I'd say. But you know, there was the proof that he had the clout. You know, that there were people that were paying attention and knew who he was. And if he came in with a demand like that, they'd say, "Oh, sure, yeah."
That, and it was St. Louis rather than New York, so
of course, yeah.
They were probably thankful. But
then, you know, I mean, filmmakers were sort of already using Toronto, I think, at that time as a sort of New York surrogate too. So people were sort of penny pinching and budget conscious, and you know, on the sort of budgets that Carpenter was working with at that time, New York was probably out of the question, you know. So
the managed to do shooting on Liberty Island.
Yeah.
Iconic shots, and apparently they were the first crew to go and shoot on the island.
Right.
According to Carpenter, anyway.
Yeah.
So they punctuated all the St. Louis stuff with the occasional New York shot and the occasional New York vibe to it,
just to keep us convinced. Yeah.
But I think the one thing that does keep us convinced is naturally it's got nothing to do with the sets. And the one thing that really makes you feel like you're in New York is Ernest Borgnine's cabby character.
Yeah.
You know, because they sell you all the time. He's landed on the World Trade Center, which kind of doesn't really look like World Trade Center because it's all dark. And okay, fair enough. And then you got like Snake comes down through the building, goes into that theater, and they're all singing the New York song on the stage. You know, it's like, you're in New York, guy. You know, it's a full-on plot. But you really don't believe it until Ernest Borgnine's character really starts to involve himself in the plot. And, you know, he's a cabbie in New York, and it really brings the authenticity to the world to life, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the cab turns up, and you think, oh yeah, this you know, this is a little bit more convincing now. And he's got the uniform and the iconic cap and everything on, you know, which plays a big part in the movie as it rolls out. But key to that, I think, is okay, he's got all the accoutrements, but the key thing is he's got that New York attitude, and that sells it. The characters are New York characters, you know, and you see it with others as well. I think. I mean, you know, even Susan Hubley's little cameo when she's sort of discovered in the chock full of nuts, you know, and then on to Isaac Hayes and his gang. These are people with that New York attitude. And what's interesting in terms of the film is the characters might not necessarily be from New York because it's being used as America's prison, so they could be people that have come from all over. But I think one of the sort of subtle messages we're getting there is the power of Manhattan Island to sort of turn you into a New Yorker, you know. And I've experienced that on the times I've been, you know. When you first go to New York, you know, you're sort of a bit sort of put out at everyone's attitude, and why is everyone snapping at me, and why is everyone behaving in this way, you know. And by the sort of middle of the week, you're doing it yourself, you know. And you sort of get that sense here, you know. We're told that this place is housing criminals from all over America, but yeah, they really do convince you with that sort of Manhattan attitude.
So just for those who haven't seen, who are listening to this and haven't seen Escape from New York or need a refresher, the plots, I was thinking in some ways this film like defies analysis, even though we are about to have a podcast analysing it. It kind of defies analysis because if you look too close into it, it's very, very basic. You've got the president's plane has crash landed in this maximum security prison island. He's been caught by the inhabitants there who've made their own world free of guards and all that kind of stuff. And only one man is crazy enough or blackmailed well enough to go in there to retrieve the president, and that's Snake Plissken. And then ahead of sort of like the Suicide Squad exploding collars, that you get him injected with.
Yeah, so he's got the classic ticking clock idea going on there. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a great movie plot. Here it's the sort of subplot or a sort of sideline. You know, that he's got to complete this mission within a certain length of time, otherwise his head explodes. You know, or whatever happens. Yeah, as you say, Adam, set against that, we've got this world of this little microcosmic world where the prisoners are allowed to sort of roam free around Manhattan, but they're not allowed out, you know, and they've got the wall and armed guards and so on to stop them. But Carpenter has said quite often throughout his career, he's sort of said how much he loves Westerns. And on occasion, he's made remarks like, "Oh, all my films are Westerns," you know, and this one definitely is. You know, this is a plot that you could easily transplant into sort of Dodge City in 1880, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it lives. It's the lone gunman, the anti-hero, the man with no name, Clint Eastwood. It's all those things. I mean, it's to the point where the eye patch is even inspired by Rooster Cogburn from True Grit. So you have those links to the westerns in the roles.
Yeah, the whole look of this character is so cool. Now, what about the guy, we've not even mentioned his name yet? The guy who plays Snake,
Mr. Kurt Russell. Yeah.
How good is he?
He's fantastic. I mean, in some ways, you could look at him and you could think, well, he's just doing a bit of a rip-off of Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy. You know, he's a grumpy man, doesn't say much, and when he does say something, it's very short and to the point, and he's amoral, anti-hero-esque character. But I think for the time, he just nailed it and elevates it beyond what Eastwood was doing with the Dollars trilogy. Particularly in New York, less so in LA, I think. But in New York, he definitely maintains that amoral and almost like anarchist style.
Well, he believes in nothing and hates everything.
Yeah, we believe in nothing, Lebowski.
Yeah, and he maintains that throughout the film from beginning to end, and I even think the Clint Eastwood voice is just an imitation, absolutely, and that has got to be something within the character. That has got to be significant. That this guy is so cool and so confident that he's elected to take on the persona of Clint Eastwood, or a specific Clint Eastwood character. Even it's not even Clint. It's as you say, it's Clint from the Dollars trilogy, and you get the sense that Snake Plissken has sort of adopted this as part of his chosen persona, as a means of impressing people and as a means of frightening or scaring or intimidating people, and along with the eye patch. We never find out why he wears the eye patch, although I think it is explained in the film novelization, where they sort of expand on the story a bit. But in the films, it's never explained where he gets that from. And I've even got this sort of one possible theory is that he might even have two functioning eyes, but he just wears it because it looks cool and it looks intimidating. So there is this element to the character where the whole look and the whole sort of attitude and everything seems so crafted to setting himself up as the sort of number one. I don't know what to call him here. He's not a good guy. He's not a bad guy. He's this loner. He's something in between that goes in and gets these jobs done, but hates every minute of it and hates the people that are asking him to do it. But what a character! And again, someone straight out of a Western.
Yeah, or in some cases, a lot of those publishing boom of the 1970s had a lot of these kind of characters. Usually they're ex-Vietnam vets who've lost all sort of like hope in the world. They're still doing jobs and missions as mercenaries, and they have no belief systems anymore. I think that
exactly. You were even getting that in detective fiction and detective movies at the time. I suppose again that might spring from Harry Callahan, another Clint Eastwood character. But yeah, there was this sort of air of cynicism in terms of, as you say, mercenaries, and it even touches on the more sort of troubled individuals like Travis Bickle, who's got nobody asking him to go on a mission, so he goes on one anyway, and he goes on one inside his own head, and that was very much a sort of characteristic of that type of American cinema, and particularly something that the younger breed of actor like to play, the sort of up-and-coming new stars, of which Russell was one. Because of course his background's interesting, because he started out as a sort of Disney discovery, hadn't he?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because he's one of those ones where, like, how did he even get this role? And it's obvious, like, Carpenter went to bat for him. He worked with him on the Elvis TV biopic.
Yeah,
but his background was Disney. It was like he was doing Disney movies. He was like the Justin Bieber or the Justin Timberlake or something like that of the 1970s, doing nice Disney live action movies, the computer wore tennis shoes and things like that, you know.
Yeah.
So he wasn't the natural choice for this role. In fact, to the point where the studio forced them to actually look at other people, you know, and think about other people. The three main ones that they talk about is like Tommy Lee Jones, who would again go on to work with Carpenter tangentially, I guess, in '86 with Black Moon Rising, film scripted by Carpenter. And Chuck Norris was another one at that time. And Charles Bronson, who feels like a misfire for me from the start, really. He's too old at that point, I think.
Yeah. Again, I'll sort of emphasise the fact that I love that they didn't cast a known tough guy for this part, because Snake has got this element of almost as though it's a game for him, you know, almost as though he's playing at it. And the Clint voice and the eye patch and everything we've already talked about. But I think the part sort of needs... There's this element, there's this undercurrent there that, he's pretending at this, you know, he's bluffing his way through it in a way that was much more evident when he played the character in Jack Burton, was it, in Big Trouble in Little China, where they go the whole hog there, where it is all a sort of subterfuge, it is a game, it is a sort of gag that he knows he's winging it and pretending. I think Snake has got more confidence in his own ability, and he is capable of being a tough guy. He's
setting himself up as like an icon, I guess, where you don't have because his character, you don't believe he's a real person, even to the point where when people meet him, they say, like, he's an actor. They say, "Oh, I thought you'd be taller," you know, because that's what people say to actors all the time, you know, and he is an actor in there. But when you meet those characters like Cabby and Isaac Hayes' character in Season Hubley, it's those characters that bring him to life in the world.
Yeah. And they all know his name as well, because there's a wonderful bit in the script, and I want to ask you about the script in a little bit, because I want to get your sort of perspective on this as someone who sort of taught script writing and so on. But there's a brilliant line that Lee Van Cleef has when he's sort of interviewing Snake towards the start of the film. And he just puts in this throwaway line where he says, "You flew the Gullfire over Leningrad, didn't you?" And the Gullfire in the movie is the glider that he then uses to sort of sneak into New York. So, "You flew the Gullfire over Leningrad, didn't you?" And then you're on to another line and they're talking about something else. Now, I sort of was really taken by that line. I was very, very pleased to see in sort of looking things up about the movie that William Gibson, the noted cyberpunk author, has also picked up on that line for many of the same reasons that I did. And Gibson said about it, "I was intrigued by the exchange in one of the opening scenes. It turns out to be just a throwaway, but for a moment it worked like the best science fiction where a casual reference can imply a lot." So the line, "You flew the Gullfire over Leningrad, didn't you?" It's 8 words, but is it telling us that there's been a World War III, or America's been involved in some conflict with Russia, and that Snake Plissken has been a big part of that, and he's come home a war hero, and maybe he's lost his eye there, or maybe he's gained his attitude there and lost his respect for authority there? There's all that in 8 little words there, and William Gibson has picked up on that, and it's played so well by Lee Van Cleef that he just delivers the line as we've said, and then it's just part of a whole sort of spiel, a whole sort of routine that he does. So it is literally a throwaway, but there's so much in there. There's so much backstory in there. And I think that's a great thing about these 2 movies. And the first one in particular, Escape from New York, in that we are given so little information, but we're given a lot of information in background and in the look of characters and in the settings and in characters' attitudes to each other. And even the big catchphrase that everybody uses about Snake in the movie in this one is, "I heard you were dead." So they all know him. They all know his name. But they think he's dead, which again has all kinds of connotations there. Do they think he's died in the war or whatever? And also, there's this sense of respect about that as well, with a sort of sense of having a bit of a dig at him as well. It's brilliant. It's superbly sort of layered in very, very small touches. We're given very, very little there.
They're definitely creating a fabric of a world, aren't they? Where they're hinting at things that haven't beyond, and you are implying that Snake was involved in all of them. It's like he is the modern folk anti-hero, I guess is the best way of looking at it. He is the guy where they tell tales about him. He's a combination of the boogeyman and an American hero. He's both,
Yeah, so he really does come over as a sort of mythical figure and as a movie figure. He is the central character in a movie rather than being a real person to an extent. I was going to ask you particularly about the early parts of this film when we're first introduced to Snake and the sort of economy of the entire script. What do you think of the way in which the information is conveyed to us here in such a sparse but informative way?
Well, I think, again, we've talked about Warriors before, but this and the Warriors, they feel very much as like blueprints of how 80s cinema was going to develop. High concept idea, rush to the first act turning point, you get him on the island, that is almost as quick as possible, to the point where Carpenter even shot a whole backstory sequence at the start of Snake robbing a bank, getting caught, and that's how they catch him. You show all that, and he just cut it out. It's like he's landing on the trade center. I don't know, 15 minutes in, like that. He's in the world within 15 minutes. And that's very, very 80s in its sort of like high concept ideas. Things like, I guess, a lot of action films of the 1980s, like Commando. They don't mess around. The daughter gets kidnapped. You're off. He jumps off the plane. He's got 18 hours to find his daughter. It's like they don't mess around in those 80s movies. And this is definitely a template for that.
Yeah, as I say, these are the first movies where the lead character doesn't necessarily need to be a convincing human being. We don't need to know about their emotions and about their family background and about how they've got to where they are at the start of the film. They're just thrown in there, like you say, in a good way. This is the word cipher is used in a sort of negative way critically, I think, usually, but I think they are sort of ciphers. They are sort of representative figures rather than being sort of rounded human beings, and that's all we need. That is all you need for this type of story. You just need the hero. It's the classic sort of hero template taken to extremes.
It's like I was saying earlier, it kind of defies analysis. If you look at it too closely, it's like a magic trick. If you look at it too closely, it starts to fall apart because there's not that much to the script. It's fairly basic, in the sense that the dialogue hints at a world beyond that, but we don't see that world beyond that. The plot's fairly basic. He's got to go into this island, get the president, and get him off the island. That's again fairly basic. And there's nothing much more to it. And the deeper you look into it, it's just like, he wanders around, meets one character, has a conversation with her. They either die or they move on. Meets another character, and it's very, very basic. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit. I mean, that was taken to its absolute extreme, I guess, with Mad Max Fury Road a few years ago. That style of storytelling where there's not a lot to it. It's just whipping you along at such a pace and absorbing you in the character and the world in such a way that by the time you even start to think about the plot or the dialogue or anything like that, the movie's over. You're on your way home. It's like
Yeah. I mean, in that movie, even to the point where, the title character is tied to the front of a moving vehicle for most of the time and doesn't actually do all that much, but as long as he's present, as long as he's there, that's all that matters. And that is absolutely a reduction of that idea. The fact that he's literally a hood ornament in this one, Yes, Snake's a great example of that. And as you say, I think Escape from New York is one of those films that really defined the 80s. Carpenter had made films in the late 70s and he was starting to make a name for himself. He could have easily just carried on making films like that. But I think he's one of the directors who really reacted to the fact that we were in a new decade and thought, right, we need a new breed and a new brand of cinema here. And he was instrumental as much as anyone in sort of creating that.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where it's like, people often say, "Oh, I love Escape from New York. Why didn't they make a series of movies starring Snake Plissken?" And it's like, well, they'd all be the same.
Yeah,
there's not much more to that character and that story. The story's told brilliantly. Well, obviously now we live in a world where it's franchise focused and something like Snake. I don't think you could have a 3-film story arc with Snake Plissken. You'd change his character too much.
Yeah. Well, look at what happened with Mad Max around the same time. The first Mad Max movie is so pared down and very much its own thing. And they did get an 80s trilogy out of that eventually. First movie's late 70s, and then they do Road Warrior in 81 and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And the only way that they could cope with that was to make the films bigger and bigger and expand that world. And I think that's the only possible way that you could have sort of followed up instantly. We got the later follow-up that we're going to be talking about, but I think the only way you could have done a sort of instant follow-up to Escape from New York would have been to follow that Mad Max template. And I think it might have dissipated the character a little bit, because Snake needs that sort. He needs to be in that very lean, very stripped down sort of world, and might not necessarily work as a bigger character. Again, they did it with the Rambo movies as well. First Blood, again, is a completely stripped down, very basic sort of survivalist movie. And then they took that character and put him into much bigger stories played out on much bigger canvases. And I just don't think that would have worked for Snake.
No, I mean, they did talk about a possible third film being Escape from Space or Escape to Space.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where they put Snake Plissken into space. But then Luc Besson did it, didn't he?
Yeah, I guess so.
To which John Carpenter did sue. And rightfully so. I mean, Lockout was just literally a complete place. But yeah, one thing we haven't talked about, and which we probably should talk about, because most of John Carpenter's films, this is a key point, and it's the music. The score for this film, again, similar to his previous score, but this one more so than Halloween, I think more so than his other work. This one really said 1980s.
Yeah.
Cynics. We're gonna score this as if you are watching a film of the future, and it elevates the movie. I mean, to the point where people have heard the soundtrack and never seen the film.
Sure. And I mean, people may not know, I'm sure fans know this, but general listeners may not know that Carpenter actually, unusually, was very, very heavily involved in the music for his films. And he sort of scored this one himself along with Alan Howarth, who was a sort of regular collaborator. And there are Carpenter fans who love his scores, and of course he's been touring them recently. He's been over in the UK even, sort of playing live concerts. It's sort of what he does now. Is and he sort of makes albums and plays gigs now. I think Carpenter fans love his scores, and I think that the real favoured ones are Assault on Precinct 13 and Christine. I think are the ones that everybody talks about as being his best. I'm going for this. I'm going for Escape from New York.
Yeah, the other ones are great, and they're more expansive. Yeah. This one's very bare, and there's almost barely an album's worth of tracks on this. But that central refrain, that central theme to the movie, it just screams dystopian 80s, future. All those things just immediately leap to mind when you hear those first few chords. Down, down, boom, boom, immediately. Oh, here we go. What's this about?
Yeah, and I'd also say that the remainder of the score is it's bare and sparse for a reason, because it absolutely fits the film. And as a listener, I would also add, what some of us like listening to bare and sparse music. So I'm quite happy with the soundtrack album for Escape from New York. I think it's great, but that opening theme, which is more sort of traditional and more typical, even then, I use those words, traditional and typical. At the time, it was groundbreaking. It's only looking back on it now that you describe it in those terms. At that time, as you've already said, Adam, it was one of the sort of key things in movies of that early part of the decade that brashly announced this is how things are going to be from now on.
Yeah. Particularly in American cinema, obviously you'd had since or dominating Italian cinema for the last 13 years or so, but definitely in American cinema.
And Carpenter would have seen all those films as well. So interestingly, he's taking influence from that, and then Italian filmmakers are coming along and absolutely ripping off, this film in particular and little bits of some of his other movies. But it all sort of rolls around, I guess. Everyone's influencing everyone else. But I suppose we need to talk as well about our sort of near local boy, Nottinghamshire lad, Donald Pleasant, who had worked for Carpenter in Halloween, of course, as Dr. Loomis, iconic character in the Halloween series that ensued. But what do we think of him here playing the American president with an American accent?
I can hear John phoning him up saying, "Yeah, Donald, I've got a good role for you. It's the President of the United States. So basically, going to bring you in for a day. Can you do an American accent? Okay, great. But what we're going to do is then we're going to beat the crap out of you and put a blonde wig on you and tie you up for the rest of the movie. Fancy it?"
to which Donald Pleasant said, "It's a payday. It's a trip to America. Why not? Yeah." So, and I think he nails it. There's an element within the way Pleasance plays the president that's similar to what we were saying about Snake earlier on. That it's almost like an act. It's almost a pretense, And I think the fact that whether he gets away with his American accent or not, I don't know. But if he doesn't, if you're on the side that says no, it just tips over a little bit too much, I think that's all part of the character again. I think that's John Carpenter sort of saying, look, the American president's always fake.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's got enough lines generally for you to sit there and think terrible accent. You know what I mean? It's like he has those sequences at the start where he's official, working through the problems, get me to the pod, and he gets in the pod, and then for me, that's the standout scene is the Duke firing the gun at him when he's chained to the wall.
Yeah,
he's forced to say, you're the Duke of New York, you're A number one. It's like the way that he delivers that line where it's like terror, fear, anger,
it's abject panic.
But also like a backbone of anger as well. I'm the goddamn president, intermingle with that there. It's brilliant with what he does. He's not got a lot to do, but he does it brilliantly to the point where the end when he has his little end of his little storyline, you buy it, and you think, yeah, okay, he's gone through hell, and then that's the suitable climax to that story. And he's in 3 scenes.
Yeah.
Ultimately, to set that story up, he's on the plane, he's on the ground, he's back at the end. So it's brilliant work from Pleasance in a very pared back role.
Yeah, I love it, and as I say, I think if you want to look for them, there are little layers and nuances in there that it's almost Carpenter saying, well, if you think this president's faking it, don't they all? Wasn't Richard Nixon faking? Isn't Reagan faking? 2 months into his run or whatever. But I mean, speaking of things presidential, and we've already talked about the 8-word line that William Gibson singled out for attention. I think the iconic line from Escape from New York is Snake's very, very simple and delivered under his breath, "The president of what?" which I don't know about you, Adam, but I'm still quoting that 40 years on, in all kinds of circumstances. What a great economic line that is.
Yeah, no, again, the script is really, really pared down, works to within an inch of its life in many ways, particularly with Snake's lines and indeed the President's lines. But there's a lot of great character actors in this film that don't have a lot to do, are not given much to do, really. They are a little step on the journey for Snake. So you got Harry Dean Stanton as Brains, You've got Adrian Barbeau in it as well. You've got all these great people. You don't do much with them, really.
There's sort of 2 levels to that, really, because Carpenter's at the point where he's sort of on the cusp of becoming really big, and this is his first film where you do get the sense this is the first time where he's got the chance to do fantasy casting, and he's sort of gone along with his list and said, can we have it? I've always wanted to work with Lee Van Cleef, Ernest Borgnine and Isaac Hayes, please, So they're all in the film. And then you've got Adrienne Barbeau, who's his wife, but also at the time they were married, and also had appeared in his films previously. And then Harry Dean Stanton and as we've already said, people like Frank Doubleday, who I think comes on and just steals every scene that he's in. He's playing a character called Romero, named after George Romero. I think there's also a character called Cronenberg in there somewhere, isn't there? Yeah. And so it's that sort of arch thing that everybody was sort of doing that at the time. These young kids who suddenly got a chance to direct movies, age sort of 28 or whatever, were all referencing each other and referencing all their favourites. But Frank Doubleday as Romero, I think what a performance that is. He's sort of Duke's not second in command, but he's sort of his eyes on the street sort of thing, isn't he? And it's almost like a mime performance. Again, he gets a few lines of dialogue in the way that Snake does and in the way that the President does, but it's not about his dialogue. It's all about his movements and the movement of his arms and legs, the way that he sort of uses his limbs in particular ways, the way that he sort of sneers and shows off those sort of needle-like teeth that he's got, that incredible hairdo that he's got. And yeah, I just think almost a brilliant, almost sort of ballet-like performance there. All great use of his sort of live, wiry sort of frame, I think, just sort of snaking into the frame and peering round corners and stuff, or suddenly holding himself very still and holding his arm up in a particular way or something. It's a brilliant physical performance. And then when he has to speak, this almost sort of hissing, sibilant-like and full of attitude, full of I own the place sort of attitude there, and a clear sort of disdain for every other character in the movie. He's almost the anti-Snake Plissken,
Yeah, they're not that far removed in some ways. From the very start when they land, and he says like, you touch me, he dies. And his lines are almost like reflective of the way he uses his body as well.
Yeah,
they're very short, they're very sharp, they're very pointed dialogue, which goes along with his character, I think.
Yeah, and he often ends them with a brilliant trademark, a great sort of squawking burst of laughter as well, which I think is another great sort of level to the character. He's this film's the Joker, really. He's that sort of character.
Yeah, he's the symbiosis of anarchy and chaos. This world.
And again, you're seeing characters like that now. Well, in the way that the Joker has been revived in the Batman films over the past 30 years, but you'll also get characters like that in the Purge movies and things like that as well. It's almost like if you're making a dystopian movie, it's got to have this sort of manic, wild-haired, screeching character with bad teeth in it, and I think a lot of that comes from Romero and Frank Doubleday in this movie.
Let's jump across the coast to coast, to Escape from LA. So, 15 years later, they reteamed for Escape from LA. At this point, Kurt Russell's a big star, more of a star than he was in this first movie. He's gone through Tequila Sunrise and Tango and Cash and a bunch of comedy movies in the 80s, Overboard, things like that. And this was, I guess he was maybe looking for a hit around this period. He had a couple of films that weren't quite as big a hits as he wanted them to be.
Yeah. And Carpenter's sort of in that position as well. He's really made his name throughout the 80s, and become a big name director. Has never really sort of broken out of sort of horror or science fiction. Particularly, I suppose his biggest sort of lurch was teaming up with Chevy Chase to do Memoirs of an Invisible Man, and even that's a science fiction movie, to a point. So, but he's become a big name within sort of cult movie circles, and again, we suddenly hit the 90s and his films aren't as critically or commercially successful as they once were. So are we in a position here where Kurt Russell needs a hit, John Carpenter needs a hit, and they both put 2 and 2 together?
It certainly feels that way, I must admit. Watching it again last night, because I saw this on release in the cinema, and I remember enjoying it and thinking it was a good film, and then watching it again, and it is so... The first film has got so much imagination, so much forward thinking with the score, with the performances, the influences that it has on 80s cinema. And then you watch this one and it's all of that's gone. There's none of the forward-looking imagination, the verve, the things that you think, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. It's basically a redo in LA.
Yeah. And one thing it does as well is it's got again, you've got this wave of fairly big name guest stars who coming on and guest starring. Basically, they're not major characters, and a lot of those roles are ones that, rather than being futuristic, hark back to the past and hark back to the movies past. We've got Peter Fonda playing, guess what, a hippie surfer, a sort of aging hippie surfer. We've got Bruce Campbell effectively playing a mad scientist, sort of 1940s style mad scientist in a great scene. I think they're both really good in the film in what they do, but and they make an impact. But what's this got to do with the world of the Escape film? What's this got to do with the futuristic world of 2013? It's very much sort of retro movie. So when it's not stealing from Escape from New York, which it does a lot, it's stealing from things that go even further back.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just a redo, but in LA.
Yeah.
And I think in the same way as that New York, I mean, Snake Plissken doesn't change the character. In this one, he's a little bit less nihilistic, I would argue. He shows some sort of human emotion.
It's almost as he's now a nihilist with a sense of humour. I think he now knows he's a nihilist and sort of uses that to his advantage. Whereas I think the Snake of the first movie was just I don't give a shit.
Yeah, and I think with the first movie, they were obviously it's Escape from New York. The name's in the title, and they are making that gritty world, that realistic world. All of which doesn't apply to LA. LA is without a massive earthquake and it being disposed of and put outside of American territory. It's still a ridiculous world, LA, normally. So they're obviously playing on that and putting Snake into a very ridiculous, hyper-real world, which I don't think it works.
No, you never get any sense of conflict there. If you're going to do that, have your character sort of reacting to that world in a way that Clint Eastwood's characters often did. That's the thing I think they miss here. Rather than reacting against that world and pointing up the satire of it, I think Snake sort of almost subsumes himself into that world and becomes another part of it by the end. It's a missed opportunity there. I think you could have really done a sort of conflicting thing there, and they've sort of you've got the setup and you've got the character to do that, and I think they sort of missed the opportunity.
Yeah, well, like we said previously, he is his own movie character. He is that icon, that folk hero, that folk anti-hero, and then putting that movie actor into a world where everyone's a movie actor. All the characters that we meet and that are characters that you would see in movies and probably not in real life. Even like, I'm trying to think of any of the real characters, I guess. The Valerie Golino character is the closest we get to a real person. Maybe the president's daughter. Maybe
even they're sort of larger than you can even imagine them in a sort of Purge movie or a Mad Max ripoff. So if they're your normal characters, the film's has gone a little bit too cartoony and a bit too far, I think.
And just in case you weren't sure it's going too cartoony, we have Snake surfing, a surfing chase scene, which is on a level with the monkeys in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It's on a level with that.
Now there are so many jumping the shark moments in this movie that there's actually one that is a jumping shark. So
yeah, no,
but yeah, the tsunami bit, and then the hang gliding at the end. I think, you know, you're just rolling your eyes at these scenes. There's a lot to enjoy in Escape from LA, but every 15 minutes you do get a sort of eye-rolling moment where you think you just think to yourself, Snake wouldn't do that.
No, yeah, no, definitely, there's definitely that, and again, showing human emotions in this movie, it's like, well, what's going on? That's not the Snake we know and love.
Yeah, I mean, what the scene for me that sort of keys the difference between the films, as you say, it's a great point you made there about the very titles of the films, Adam. And you know, pitting New York versus LA says such a lot there. And I think the film itself often tries to copy or riff on moments from Escape from New York. We've got Another President in there, for example, you know. But I think the scene that exemplifies that is they try and do an equivalent of the great gladiatorial arena scene in Escape from New York that's set in this sort of rundown basement somewhere where they've set up this sort of wrestling ring. And who's the wrestler? Ox Baker, is it? Yeah, the great hulking wrestler. And he fights Kurt Russell with spiked baseball bats in this ring with everyone around cheering on. It's a fantastic scene in Escape from New York. And the equivalent to that in Escape from LA is this sort of solo basketball challenge. And it's obviously there as a means of trying to sort of recapture that same sort of let's put Snake in a situation that he can't possibly get out of sort of thing, where he's clearly going to die, and his ticking wristwatch shows that he's got 2 hours left to go anyway, but he's going to die here, you know. And he's basically, rather than fighting this sort of man mountain armed with a spiked baseball bat, he's playing basketball against himself. And it's just not got anywhere near the same sense of peril and endangerment there. And you sort of know he's going to get out of it. You know, it's set against the clock sort of thing. He's got to score so many baskets within a certain length of time. But you know how it's going to end up, and you know he's going to get out of there. Whereas in the first movie, Ox gets into the ring, and you think, he's got no chance. You know, what's going to happen now? Yeah, end of movie sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they're really trying to pull what does LA mean to people, and then putting Snake in situations that reflect that. You know, so you have I guess the basketball is the Lakers. I guess they were popular at the time. I don't know enough about basketball to know that, but it feels like having that kind of like setting.
Yeah,
was their thought, but really they should have been thinking like, well, they have those sort of like car chases down the Thunder Road sort of thing, you know, in Grease and in Terminator, and just do that. That's what LA people don't think of that as LA as well. That's much more exciting. Yeah, have a car chase bit.
In this film, what they do is they set up LA as being this sort of hotbed of vice and sin and everything, and it's actually physically detached from America because of earthquake activity, and they built a wall around it. So it's the same sort of central idea, very similar sort of central idea to Escape from New York. Now, interestingly, what we're told is the rest of America has now become this sort of anodyne, sort of very religious, supposedly moral, evangelical sort of place, with this sort of president who's trying to sort of pitch extreme family values across the country, across the 50 states. You know, do you know what? I'd almost prefer to have seen Snake Plissken in that setting rather than in Los Angeles. I think that might have made for a more interesting conflict and a better film. Let's have Snake taking on the religious right.
Well, he's comfortable in that world. Bizarrely, the worlds that they've been putting him in, he's comfortable in those worlds. There's no threat to him, really. I mean, even when people are getting shot, he doesn't care. He moves on. You know, it's like he's comfortable in those kind of worlds. Putting him in a world where he's not comfortable would be More interesting whether you could do that, because these characters are so monosyllabic and defined. I think it'd be difficult. It'd be more like First Blood.
Yeah.
I guess when Stallone rolls into town at First Blood. And
well, again, you're talking about a much more stripped down sort of thing. So basically, what we want is a film that's much more like with the tone of Escape from New York, rather than this sort of cartoon circus sort of thing. But it's got good moments, and we've said Frank Doubleday sort of stole the show in Escape from New York. I think they try and do the same with Steve Buscemi here, and it doesn't quite come off. He's playing a character who sort of flits in and out very much in the way that Doubleday did.
For me, he's the cabbie character in this one. He's moving Snake along the plot in the way that Cabbie does.
I think he's a mixture of the two, because he's with Cabbie, you sort of always knew that he was on Snake's side. I think with Buscemi's character here, you're never quite sure whether he's going to do good or bad for Snake, whether he's lying to him or not. And Buscemi at this time was very much, he's become almost a sort of forgotten figure now to an extent. But at that time, he was just about the hottest ticket in Hollywood for this type of supporting role. If you'd got a part in your film for the guy who was going to be sort of third on the poster, he was the first person that most producers went to at that time. He was still trading off his success in Tarantino's films, and in particular Reservoir Dogs. And this is 96. This is 4 or 5 years after that. And Steve Buscemi was still the guy that you had to get in your film at that point. And I think there's a sense of give or take in this, because Carpenter clearly wanted him in his film. I think Buscemi probably said yes to this because it was a John Carpenter movie, whereas other people pitching this, if Joe Blow had gone in and said, "Oh, we're making this film about this guy who comes to this sort of imprisoned and walled version of LA," he'd have said, "I'm not interested. It sounds daft." But if John Carpenter comes and says it, you'd think, "I want to work with John Carpenter." So, there's a bit of give and take there, I think. But Buscemi's good, but he reminded me a lot in this film of, because he does tend to mug a little bit in it. And he reminded me, he's almost like an American equivalent of our own Adrian Edmondson, I think, in this movie. There's a little bit too much sort of smirking at the camera and sort of laughing at himself and being pleased with his own performance sort of thing, which I suppose fits the world of this film, but it sort of doesn't quite fit the world of Snake Plissken.
Yeah, I think everybody in this film, other than Snake, is mugging. Even Snake's mugging to the camera. In this, it's definitely over the top. The plastic surgeon's over the top plastic surgeon. The Pam Grier later on in the movie as the transgender carjack from his past. That's an over-the-top depiction that you wouldn't get away with nowadays,
No.
And really, you shouldn't have got away with it then. It was a cheap gag, a cheap scene.
Yeah, it is very weird, very sort of uncomfortable viewing, and you do sort of think as you're watching it, Pam Grier's obviously had a whole career where she will have faced all kinds of sort of abuse and all kinds of weird sort of suggestions and offers from producers and things, but you do see her in this part, and you think, what was she thinking? How was this pitched to her, and why did she say yes? But a job's a job, I guess.
Yes,
And again, Carpenter's a guy that a lot of these people would have sort of been fans of, and the chance to work with him was obviously one that they'd sort of say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that, whatever the part," and maybe that's part of it. The music in the film as well, I think, is a big letdown. It's interesting story on this, because Carpenter's theme is used again. There's a good sort of remix or redo of the classic main theme at the start, but then the score itself is largely taken over by Shirley Walker, who was well known as being a real sort of breakthrough artist, one of the very, very first women to actually get into a position where she was writing solo scores for movies from the sort of mid-70s onwards. And this, for me, isn't among her best work and doesn't fit the film, I don't think.
No, I agree. I'm not quite sure what would fit the film, but this one doesn't. It's because the film's such an over-the-top caricature. I guess, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, was Carpenter in a position at this stage where he wasn't actually able to insist on doing the music himself, or did he not want to for this one? I don't know. I don't know why they made these choices on the soundtrack.
Yeah, no, it's unusual considering the soundtrack is such a big part of the original. I think even all this said, as much as I love Escape from New York, and I'm not as fond of Escape from LA. I do still enjoy Escape from LA.
It's a fun ride.
Yeah, but it does expose the sort of like the basic storytelling more in this one than in the first one. But I think the other thing I want to bring up, because I'm a big John Carpenter fan. He's a brilliant director. I'm not sure actions is genre though. I don't think he directs action. I think he directs action okay, but I don't think he elevates the action scenes in either movie, really.
No, which is probably why he's steered clear from them in the past, And the only other film that he'd made on this sort of scale and with this sort of scope was Big Trouble in Little China, I think. And again, that's a film that's got its problems. It's much better than Escape from LA, but it's again he's good with the characters in that, but the big action set pieces, he sort of gets away with them a little bit more in Big Trouble in Little China because a lot of that movie is played for laughs, and so he kind of plays the action scenes as over the top as well. And I think they work a lot better than the action here. As I say, there are a lot of moments in the film that are what you'd call sort of jumping the shark moments, and I think you can include all of the action scenes in that. They all seem completely out of place. They don't convince you as things that Snake Plissken would get involved in. And they're not even really all that memorable.
No. I literally watched it last night and I'm struggling to remember them now.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, a lot of them are just short bursts of violence and then that's it, There's no real verve or ingenuity about the way that they are choreographed.
Yeah, I mean that whole big hang gliding set piece at the end just sort of goes nowhere and just had me sort of thinking in the way that it is shot and staged. Visually, it reminded me of the Hawkmen sequence from Flash Gordon, and I just thought that sort of came to my mind, and I thought, well, that did this sort of thing right, and this isn't doing it with the same sort of impact.
I think one of the big things as well is like there's not a really strong villain in this one. I think the villain in the Duke in New York, he's threatening, he's dangerous, he owns that land, he's a number one, Whereas you don't get that feel with, I forgot his name now.
What's he called? Cuervo.
Cuervo, yeah.
Yeah, Cuervo.
You don't get the same vibe from him. You don't feel like there's the same threat from him.
No. Well, he's not got much physicality about him, for one thing, and he seems to rely a lot more on his entourage, whereas the Duke is very clearly the guy calling the shots, and he barks out an order, and everybody, the whole island of Manhattan responds to it, and there's no sense of that here. It's a more sort of enclosed, close-knit sort of group around him. And yeah, there's not the sense of authority, is there? There's not the sense of threat because of that.
No, and I don't think the Che Guevara cipher thing works for this at all. You kind of feel like, well, you're going to set it in LA. Let's have a real LA bad guy. Wouldn't you have like the head of Walt Disney or something like that as your main villain, or something like that,
Well, that's why I say, if you're pitching this world where LA is separated from America and America has now become this sort of evangelist paradise and the sort of moral majority nightmare sort of thing, I'd rather see Snake Plissken versus Jimmy Swaggart or something. It's let's put him right in the middle of Bible Belt America rather than in this carnival, The film just it seems too broad and too comic. I mean, we sound like we're really having a go at it. I think it's a film where we love Snake and we love Carpenter and we love the whole sort of world of Escape from New York so much that we want any spin-offs or sequels or anything that's attached to that world to be good, and Escape from LA is great fun. It's very watchable, but it's disappointing in the sense that it's not what it could have been.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd agree with that. They've continued to try and remake this movie on and on. Apparently Neil Cross did the most recent screenplay that's been knocking around Hollywood. I think they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle to remake this film because, I said,
who do you find to play Snake Plissken?
Well, that's one of the problems. Who replaces Kurt Russell? And also, but what's the script going to be? Because you probably can't get away with the sparseness of the script of New York and LA nowadays. You just can't.
No, I'm sure they'll if they do inevitably get round to doing another film using the character. It'll go big. It'll be what we were talking about earlier. If this character doesn't fit into the LA that we see in Escape from LA, he's not going to fit into anything bigger than that. And that's what we're going to be offered.
Yeah, it'll be Snake Plissken rescuing the president's daughter, who's 7.
Yeah,
and it's him having to take a 7-year-old through a battered landscape, and stop her crying and that kind of pull funny faces to make her laugh, that kind of stuff. That'll be it.
Yeah, yeah. Starring Tom Hardy in a wig. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, Tom Hardy seems to be the go-to guy for these guys. He replaced Mel Gibson with.
Yeah, I like him a lot, but he's no Snake Plissken.
No, he's not. I mean, I don't know who you'd replace. I really don't know.
Well, they as we often say when we're talking about older movies, whether we're going back to the 30s and 40s or even going back to the early 80s now. There's a breed of actor that they don't make anymore.
Cool. Thank you very much, Darryl.
Okay, Adam.
Enjoyable diversion into the past future. I'm sure we'll come back to John Carpenter in the future at some point. I want to thank Quad and the BFI for supporting these podcasts. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks' time.